Like a backstage pass to the world of fly fishing travel, this is Waypoints, the podcast of destination angling. News and events, helpful travel tips, destination profiles, great stories, and expert advice from some of the most seasoned and experienced names in fishing travel. Waypoints is brought to you by Yellow Dog Fly Fishing Adventures, the industry's #1 specialty travel company for the very best insider knowledge, logistical support, and trip preparation. Freshwater or saltwater, international or domestic, Yellow Dog has you covered for your next fishing adventure. And now, your Waypoints host, Yellow Dog founder and director, Jim Klug.
Welcome to Waypoints and an episode that we're dedicating to one of the most badass game fish species on the planet, the legendary Caranx ignobilis, better known as the giant Trevally. In the 2016 book, A Fly Fisher's Guide to Giant Trevally, author Peter McLeod refers to GTs on a fly rod as the pinnacle of flats fishing, highly challenging, and a pursuit that requires both skill and preparation. Known in angling circles as the gangsters of the flats, giant trevally are true apex predators. They fear nothing, will eat almost anything, and when hooked on a fly or any type of light tackle, deliver a brutal and electrifying fight. The typical GT eat can be violent and insanely fast, and they are famous for destroying equipment and shattering dreams. All of these things collectively make the species one of the most addicting in all of saltwater. I'm joined today by two guests that collectively know a ton about chasing GTs on the fly. And in today's episode, we're going to go deep on this subject of chasing these incredible fish. We'll talk in detail about where to find GTs, their general behavior, what they eat, how tides can affect GT fishing, the right gear and equipment, favorite flies, effective presentation, and how best to fight and land these magnificent creatures. Whether you're an angler who has never caught a GT on a fly rod, someone who is mildly curious about GT fishing, or if you're an experienced GT angler that is already cursed with the addiction, you're going to learn a lot from these two seasoned veterans. My first guest is longtime Waypoints contributor ALEC GERBEC, Yellow Dog Fly Fishing's program director for the Seychelles and Indian Ocean region, and the former head guide for Alphonse Fishing Company in the Seychelles. ALEC lived and worked for several years in the Indian Ocean and to date has fished many of the world's top GT destinations. We're also joined by Seychelles guide Gary de Klerk. Gary currently guides full-time on Cosmoledo Atoll and has worked as a guide on Alphonse and Estove. Gary grew up in Johannesburg, South Africa, started his guiding career on South Africa's Orange River before joining the Alphonse Fishing Company team several years ago. Gary's passing through Bozeman during his off-season from guiding in the Seychelles. And when we found out he was here, we knew we had to get these two together to pick their brains on GT fishing. Basically a total mind dump of Trevally knowledge. Gentlemen, welcome to the show and thanks for joining us for this GT sit-down.
Cheers, Jim. Thank you very much for having us. Happy to be here.
Well, Gary, welcome to Bozeman, too. You just showed up, and we got you right in the studio here. We had to find out everything you know about GTs for our listeners. We thought, what a great opportunity.
Yeah, well, it's great to be a beautiful place.
Yeah, and ALEC, a long-time contributor to the podcast, many episodes in the past, and certainly one of the most knowledgeable saltwater anglers and GT fishermen in the game. Thanks for sitting down with us again.
Thanks for having me again, Jim. And yeah, the juices are already flowing talking about GTs with that introduction.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, again, the most badass game fish you can possibly tackle on a fly. They're just one of a kind. Well, that brings up the first question, and this is a general one, but simply why? What is it about GTs that make them such a draw for saltwater anglers? Why the hype, and is it real?
Yeah, it's a pretty unique fish. It's something you wouldn't expect to sometimes be found in shin to knee deep water, upwards of, sometimes close to 100 pounds. They find themselves in really interesting places and will be acting very calm and, casually moving through the flats. But as soon as they see red and want to kill something, it's explosive. And I've just never met a more adrenaline filled fish to target. So they're, one of a kind.
The hype is legit.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So Gary, for those that haven't seen a GT in person, right? Describe what this fish looks like. What makes this creature so unique?
Jeez, well, the first thing that stands out to me, first time I ever laid eyes on a GT, was the size of their eyes and how they are able to see prey, be that your fly sometimes, how they see it, and they're just not afraid of anything, and they're just this big, as you said, badass fish. Big shoulders, sharp tails, just really streamlined, aggressive-looking fish.
Yeah, the fins on these fish, I mean, the pectoral fins almost look like wings on a bird sometimes. They're so powerful.
Yeah, I mean, that moment where they light up on the fly, it's like they've started their jet engines. You see those dorsals come out and mouth opens up, eyes just staring right at your fly. It's, pretty exciting.
And the mouth of a GT, I mean, that's another thing that makes these fish so unique. It is designed to eat anything this GT wants to go after.
Yeah, it's almost like a boa constrictor. It's funny. I mean, they have a very streamlined look when it's closed, but as soon as they open up, it's like, oh my gosh, it can fit a lot in there.
It must be the most terrifying thing in the world to be their prey and kind of look behind you and see that mouth coming at you, because you're just not going to win. You're done at that point.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. If he wants something, he's going to get it.
He's going to get it.
He's going to get it.
Every time. Well, GTs are classified in the Jack family. And in some ways, they appear to kind of be similar to like a Jack Crevalle, but they're different in so many other ways. I mean, their strength, their stamina, their size, their coloration, all of these things are kind of what puts GTs in a league of their own. When you think about what they're built for, which is speed, aggressiveness, again, the ability to eat anything they go after, that's the difference basically between a regular Jack and a GT.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of spoke to it earlier, is what's really unique about a GT is they're not scared to hunt very shallow water. And that's dominantly where we target them. Certainly you find them in deep water like you do with Jacks. And, Jacks will get shallower, but yeah, sometimes their back is out of the water and you can throw a 10-inch fly at them and they'll come and chow it. So
smoke it.
Yeah.
Yeah, the scenarios you find yourself in, really unique.
Yeah.
And so often it's wade fishing, which we're going to talk about here in a second as far as where they're found and typical fishing scenarios. But some interesting GT facts. Normally, they start out kind of a silvery color. Sometimes they have some dark spots on them. But that's oftentimes when they're smaller. And as they get larger, they actually change their look and their coloration. The males tend to get darker, right? Kind of a dusky color, or oftentimes even jet black for the big males. And that typically happens after they get above roughly 50 centimeters in length. The females, they will darken up as well, but they still largely stay kind of a lighter colored silver gray. And you see these GTs of all different colorations, especially when they get bigger.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And then, I mean, Gary, you can speak to this too, but how often they change colors on you.
Yeah. Yes, when they, a lot of the fish we going after are sitting on rays, and to match the color of that skate he's sitting on, he'll be black or, super dark in color. And if you spook that fish or even hook it, you can see it go from a dark black to a light silver.
Quickly.
You can see it within seconds.
It's crazy, like an inherent camouflage that they have and the ability to adapt to their environment and change things around. That's wild. So they get big. Obviously, we know that. Largest recorded fish over 67 inches, and they can grow in weight to over 175 pounds. I mean, that is a terrifying fish to pursue on a fly rod when you think about the power of these GTs. They grow relatively fast. They reach sexual maturity at a length of around 60 centimeters, about 3 years of age. And it seems like a lot of the GTs that you catch, up to 60 centimeters is like, okay, great fish. There's quite a few of them around, a lot of fun on a fly. But when they pass that 3-year period, when they get above 60, it's like, okay, now you're dealing with a whole different animal here, a whole different species.
Yeah, they're all unique with their approach towards your fly, their fight and everything like that. But yes, even starting at 60, they're just super aggressive, really fun to target. And as they get bigger, their behaviors change and your approach kind of changes fish to fish too. You find so many different situations where it's like, I swear I know how to cast to this fish, but he's acting weird. Let's try this. Boom.
Yeah, agreed. Once that fish hits 60, it just exponentially gets stronger from that point on. And, you catch a fish under 60 and you think, oh, why am I using a 12 weight? This is a bit overkill. And then you hook yourself a 90 centimeter fish and you know exactly why. Now we use 12 weights.
Yeah, you're like, oh, I feel undergunned. This
Yeah.
thing is a beast. Well, I'm willing to bet that a lot of our listeners have seen footage of GTs or they've read about GT fishing, but most have never seen a GT in real life, unless maybe they were at like the Shed Aquarium or something like that and saw them swimming around. Let's talk for a moment about where you're likely to be fishing if you're specifically targeting giant trevally. What are the hot spots for targeting GTs on the fly? Gary, obviously, the conversation always starts with the Seychelles, where you work.
Yes, yeah, I got to put my hand up straight away and say Cosmoledo. It got its name being the GT capital of the world, and yeah, that's no word of a lie. It is the truth. They are everywhere there. It's, incredible place.
Yeah, the Seychelles are obviously kind of at the top of the list for a lot of anglers. Where else would you be fishing for GTs? Where else is it going to take you if you're a saltwater fly fisherman targeting these things?
Yeah, the whole expanse of the Indian Ocean, really, all the way down to Cape Town, I would say, right, Gary?
Just a little bit further east, but yeah.
Yeah, and then so all the way north up into the Red Sea, all the way to the west coast of Australia, and then hop over to the Pacific, and you catch them all the way to Hawaii, sort of thing. So quite a big expanse for them.
Yeah, their distribution is a lot wider than I had originally thought. From the tropical and subtropical waters, the Bay of Bengal, throughout the Indian Ocean, as you said, Alec, all throughout the Pacific, which is really interesting too. They got a huge range, tip of South Africa, north along the African coastline to the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf. Then they go eastward along the Asian coastline. It includes the coastlines of Pakistan, India, all the way into Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Philippines, Japan. You find them, Northern Australia, of course, Hawaii, a legendary fish in Hawaii. But the famous sport fishing areas where destination angling, there's an infrastructure, it's set up for GTs. Of course, we're talking Seychelles. Christmas Island is a spot that's very popular. Oman has some massive GTs, absolutely huge. Australia, Maldives, Hawaii. They find quite a few really big ones in Hawaii. St. Brandon's Atoll. Alec, you and I just did a recent podcast on St. Brandon's and fishing there in the Indian Ocean. Eastern Africa, numerous islands and atolls all throughout the Pacific. So quite a few places you can target them. But there are 4 or 5 known destinations, Seychelles, St. Brandon's, places like that, Christmas Island, where if people want to go and target GTs, those are the spots.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it has a lot to do with their food source. While they can live in a lot of places, these places like Seychelles has such an abundant food source on the flats that you're going to get a pretty good amount of shots, at least seeing them, if not catching them.
Well, you mentioned earlier, you find them in deep water sometimes they're an offshore fish. We all target them on the flats, but why? They go from being a fairly deep water fish to being up on the flats. And can you target them in both situations, or is one more productive over the other?
Yeah, 100%. We tend to spend more time on the flats targeting them based on the tidal movements. They can't be on the flat the entire day. They come in on the push and leave on the drop. But we do spend a decent amount of time in the deep water poling skiffs around coral bommies, looking for usually larger fish in the deeper water. But yeah, flats definitely a numbers game from that perspective.
So when you guys are on the flats and you know where these fish are, you're out there every day of the season. What are you looking for when you're hunting GTs on the flats? Are they a fish that do they tend to gravitate towards structure? Do they like close proximity to the drop-offs in deeper water? Are there certain areas where you're like, okay, I'm starting here because this is what GTs love? Or is it more tidal dependent, food source dependent? Talk us through that a little bit.
Well, yeah, I'd say they do enjoy structure. A lot of the time we're looking for cuts in the surf, in the lagoon, where those fish are going to push up first, where the water's going to hit the flat first. That's where they're going to come up. And a lot of the time that the Jeets love to follow stingrays and sharks. That's most of the fishing we're doing. We're looking for nurse sharks. We're looking for lemon sharks. We're looking for brown skates. And all of these creatures hold Jeets, up to 10, 20 fish at a time.
So has your experience been, having worked in some of these areas like Cosmo and Alphonse, for several seasons, do you guys typically find that a lot of these fish are homebodies, meaning you see the same fish in the same areas? You pull onto a flat and be like, okay, I know there's always, this particular big dark fish that maybe you know by name at this point in time. You're like, this is where we find him. He frequents this area. Do they stay in the same general areas, or is it just a constant influx of new and different fish? I know it's a hard question to answer, but are they somewhat homebodies in particular areas?
Yeah, a little bit of both for sure. And, Gary will be able to speak to this in a second about kind of the GT tagging system that they've done over the last number of years and some of the information they've gathered from that. It's really interesting. But yeah, from my guide days, certainly I remember certain fish. They were your quote unquote pets. Took a break, started working for Yellow Dog, gone now back since with hosted trips. That same fish is still doing the same thing I remember guiding. So it's really cool to see some of these patterns that they continue to hold. But then, yeah, you have, wind changes or whatever that will bring this influx of fish in that it's like, that guy's never seen a fly before. So it's a little bit of everything.
Yeah. Talk to us a little bit about that GT tagging program that Alphonse Fishing Company has been doing the last few years, Gary. What are some of the takeaways? What have they learned about fish behavior, migration, jumping around to different parts of a particular atoll, or are they, going to different atolls altogether? Are they making long crossings in the Seychelles?
Yes, so the GT tagging program has been around for a good few years now, and it's a pit tagging program where we tag any size of GT. As soon as we can identify it's a GT, we tag it. And it's a system that you have to recapture that fish in order to scan a fish if it's tagged or not, and then you can capture the data. So we measure the size, the length of the fish, and we take waypoints with GPS on where that fish was caught. So we're able to determine his hunting patterns. Are they the same? Is he hunting in the same areas? And how long has he, how big has he gotten over the years?
Have you guys had some success in recapturing fish that have been tagged and then caught a season later or a couple seasons later?
Yes, we have. Most of the time, more often than not, it's the same fish that was recaptured in the same area within, a month or 2 months on the same tidal, in the same tidal movements. But we do get bigger fish that are captured 2-3 years later. And more often than not, it's in a similar situation, similar scenario of where it was first caught.
That makes sense. And, there's a lot of thought that they are, kind of creatures of habit. They know where they like to feed. They know where they've found success. And so they are kind of homebody fish. And that tagging program is showing that to largely be true.
Yeah, 100%. And an extremely clever fish. I mean, the recapture rates, if I'm not mistaken, is between 5 and 10%. So most of those fish, once you prick them with the fly, he knows, I'm not going to eat those feathers again. Extremely clever fish.
Yeah, they learn. They remember things.
Exactly.
Now, have you caught any on St. Francois that were tagged on Alphonse or vice versa sort of thing?
Yes, there have been fish that have moved between Alphonse and St. Francois. There was, when the tagging program started, there was also a couple of fish that we tagged with acoustic tags, so we could actively track them with acoustic sensors where they move. And a lot of the fish would, if tagged on St. Francois, would stay there. But also a fair amount would move between the two atolls.
Yeah, and for listeners that aren't familiar, so when you go to Alphonse, the fishing largely takes place over on St. Francois, which is kind of an adjacent fishery. It's across a deep channel. And how far is it? Is it like 10 kilometers, or how far is that distance between the two?
I'd say 2.5-3 miles. Okay. Fairly close.
Yeah, fairly close. But those fish will move back and forth across that deep channel.
Across that channel. Exactly.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, they're unbelievable. And we talk about how they are this apex predator that are pretty much fearless, right? And they're kind of at the top of the game out there. You mentioned a moment ago, Gary, that a lot of times you'll find them on the backs of sharks, certainly on rays, and that's something you're always kind of hunting for when you're guiding. It could be lemon sharks, nurse sharks, very common, but sometimes you'll see big GTs on the back of tiger sharks, right? Bull sharks.
Yep.
And they don't care. They're not worried about anything.
Yeah, it's wild. You will never be surprised after a while. It's like, well, yeah, of course you'd be following a turtle or whatever. It's like, what the heck is this thing doing?
Yeah, they truly are apex. They're not fazed about anything.
Well, I was reading up on them as we were kind of doing a little research for this program, and I came across a couple stories about big adult GTs that were crazy. They have actually been recorded attacking sharks, like big black tips. They're larger than the GT is, but they will repeatedly ram them with their head. The shark, oftentimes larger than the Trevally, dies from the attack, and then the GT just swims away. It's not like they're eating it. It's like they're trying to prove a point or something. It's like, hey, I can take down this shark. It's like, no way. It's like, yeah, watch, I'm going to try. And they do it, and they will kill these sharks and then just swim off because they can.
That's wild.
Yeah, there was also a story from Hawaii where a spear fisherman was basically attacked by a GT who just repeatedly rammed him to the point where he broke several ribs. I mean,
Jeez.
So just fearless fish.
Yes, that's cool. I can remember a scenario. Obviously, this is not to the extreme of it doing what it wants with something bigger than it, but we were on East Knoll and we just suddenly see this splashing and what looks like a volleyball flying in the air. As we get closer, we notice it's a puffer fish fully expanded. And this GT is literally just like volleying it. I don't think he wants to eat it. He's just like playing with this fully inflated puffer fish.
Beating the crap out of this puffer
doing?
fish.
Yeah.
Because it can.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty wild. But at the same time, and Gary, I mean, they can be spooky, right? I mean, you have an angler out there, whether you're fishing from the bow of the skiff or more commonly you're wade fishing, maybe you're in knee deep or waist deep water. And it's very possible, even though it's this kind of fearless apex predator, you can spook these things and blow them up with a bad cast or a kind of a half-assed presentation.
Yeah, 100%. They're very aware of their surroundings. I mean, the lateral line on them is huge. They can feel vibrations from all around them. And it's weird. When they spook, it almost seems it's not in a sense of being scared. It's more something's not right here. I'm just going to make my way back to the ocean. I'm getting off this flat.
Yeah, I'm annoyed.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. What are common things that anglers oftentimes do that will spook GTs? I mean, bad casting, loud wading. What do you typically see?
I'd say, if I had to put it to two, I'd say water loading. That fly, when it hits the water, it needs to be the shot that's presented to the fish. And then second, stomping around on the boat. That's a big one.
Yeah. Yeah, that pretty much applies to all fish, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but some, again, common mistakes that anglers make in spooking these fish, and largely has to do with just stealth approach. And I think you brought up a good point, water loading. A lot of people, especially with those heavier rods,
exactly.
They'll make kind of a halfway cast and then go to rip it off the water again to make that final presentation.
A common mistake is the fly lands too close to the fish. These fish can see a fly before it's hit the water. They can see it, the fly that's coming towards them before it's even landed in front of them. And more often than not, that fish will swim 25 feet to come and eat your fly.
You're like, why?
Yeah.
And they do.
Exactly.
They see it, they feel it, and they just want it.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a common thing and hard to get in your head, like a lead of 2 to 3 rod lengths. And so often that bad cast, if you play it out, that fish turns and comes screaming over before you're into your third strip sort of thing. So always play it out, don't recast it, water load it, and see what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there times when you see highly aggressive behavior from these fish when they're on the flats where they're just going to eat everything? And I guess, like an example, if you go down to the Keys and you catch that palala worm hatch, right? I mean, it's almost like those fish have lost any element of fear or common sense. They're just, completely focused on these things, and they're eating with a little more reckless abandon than tarpon normally would. Are there any events that you see a similar type of behavior from GTs on the flats?
In my experience guiding Alphonse, I saw something pretty unique where there was this, sudden hatch of a rabbit fish, which was, about a 2 to 3 inch kind of rusty red bait fish. And we saw a tenfold amount of GTs on this atoll for the next 10 days as they were devouring every single bait fish that was on the flats. And it was such a cool event because we pulled into the atoll in the morning and it just looked like there was new coral heads everywhere, but it was all these bait balls. And upon further inspection, you'd see it go from a ball to a donut to black jeets just going nuts. And then you look at the finger flats. There's big splashes over there, big splashes over there. All the guides are freaking out, like, I don't know what's happening, but let's get the boat, let's go. So definitely there are some events, at least that I've seen on Alphonse. And then Farquhar, obviously, they have the sooty terns that, once those fledglings are, on the beaches, those things get quite lit up.
Oh, I want to talk about that in a second because that's a pretty phenomenal occurrence. But when you guys are polling the flats, when you're out there with clients, do you ever come across a situation, especially if you're like out in the surf, for example, where you're finding GTs that are laid up, like you can sometimes find laid up tarpon, or are GTs always on the move and kind of hunting?
More often than not, they usually are on the move, but you do definitely find laid up fish, especially in the deeper water, sitting on coral heads. That's a large fish waiting to ambush something. He's dark, he's sitting in that coral head, sitting in the shadow. And yeah, you do see that a fair amount.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
The ambush predator.
Special way to fish.
Yeah, for sure. Well, one thing, and we've talked about how, you might make a cast that you're thinking, oh, that fly's way too far from that fish. He's not going to see it. And then he does, and he lights up on it. One fact that's super interesting is how giant trevally actually see. Gary, you said it in the beginning when you were describing a GT, they have this massive eye that, again, like kind of a tarpon, Megalops atlanticus. It's like, it's big for a reason and they see everything. But GTs even take it to the next level. They have this horizontal streak, basically like this bionic stripe down the center of the eye. And it's believed that this allows GTs to actually have a panoramic view of their complete surroundings, right? They can kind of remove the need to constantly be moving the eye to scan what's out there. It's just inherently built into their eye through this stripe. And that's a crazy feature. There's not too many fish that have that. But again, one of the reasons it's such a perfect predator when it comes to seeing everything that's surrounding it.
Yes, 100%. That fish is not looking within a 5 feet radius to hunt. He's looking out there, seeing what he can see from 30, 40 feet away.
And you guys have probably seen that time and time again where, again, an errant cast or something that you're thinking, oh, it's behind the fish, he's never going to see it. And all of a sudden that fish just lights up and smokes a fly. And you're like, I did not see that coming.
Yeah. Or let's say you're bone fishing and you're well up on the sand and you're fighting this fish and out of nowhere, here comes a single or a couple of jeets to come try to eat your bonefish. You're like, how did you even see that? Where did you come from?
Well, that brings up a good point. I want to transition into talking about food, what GTs love to eat. What are their main food sources? I mean, you mentioned bonefish. It's a known fact that GTs love bonefish. It's like a GT Twinkie, right? They're always going to try to eat that if they can. But what's their primary food sources?
From what, I mostly experienced on Alphonse, it's any sort of bait fish. So that includes bonefish, mullet, snappers, groupers, emperors, anything that swims and small enough to fit in their mouth. Certainly crustaceans and squid and things like that. So prawns, shrimp, crabs, you name it. And then moving into the less traditional things like baby turtles, birds, you name it.
There's not too many things that GT won't eat if it decides it wants it.
Yeah.
Primarily bait fish, but you've got the cephalopods, the squids, the octopus, things like that. They're known lobster hunters. They love to eat lobsters, of course. But let's talk about two things you just mentioned there. The juvenile sea turtles, which is a thing when they hatch, GTs will come right in and just crush these things. You've probably seen that multiple times, I would guess.
Yeah, I mean, some of you listening have probably heard me tell this story, but my first night on Alphonse, first year of guiding, riding my bike down to the beach bar, it's evening, and I come across, a bunch of baby turtles that have just hatched that are coming onto the path. And I was like, oh, I'm going to do this good thing. I'm going to gather them up in my basket. I'm going to bring them down to the water. I'm going to release them. So one by one, I'm letting them go, and I just start hearing boof, boof. Put my headlamp out there, and there's 3 big black jeets just waiting for me to throw the next one. I was like, oh, my God.
Like, more, please.
Yeah.
You're an enabler.
Yeah. So definitely, around those moons when the turtles hatch, throw a black fly.
Oh, they do love a bit of a soft shell turtle.
When they're nice and juicy as the little babies.
Sure, the poor things.
Well, and the other thing that the Seychelles in particular, Farquhar is famous for, are GTs that eat birds. And years ago, I was like, oh, yeah, that might happen. Occasionally they might target a bird that's on the water. But no, it's an actual thing out there.
Yes.
And the BBC in Blue Planet 2, I think episode 1, they actually sent a film crew out there and they captured this on Farquhar. And they're juvenile sooty terns When they hatch, there's about 1 million of them on the water. And these GTs know that this annual event is happening. They show up in lines of infantry. They're all out there in the surf, and they just start crushing these birds.
Yep.
I mean, and I believe, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, they've never documented this anywhere else in the world other than on Farquhar in the Seychelles, but it's a thing, and it happens pretty much every year, and they are crushing these birds.
Well, it's definitely a spot where fish have learned a hunting technique specific to that destination. I don't think it's something that happens. I've never seen it on Cosmo or Alphonse, but the boys on Farquhar have all said they've seen it happen. After that documentary came out, there's no doubt that it doesn't.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's not like they're just eating birds off the surface like a trout eats a dry fly. No. They're seeing these birds flying low across the water. They're kind of projecting where that bird's going to be. They're playing, the trajectory and the angles on, and they're launching themselves out of the water and hammering these things in the air.
Oh, it's a fish that can make that calculation of the bird being outside of the water, and sometimes they'll do that with your fly. They can track a fly from outside of the water. It's an incredible species.
Yeah, they are just smart as hell, as you were saying a minute ago, Gary.
Yeah, I think they just adapt so quickly. Another example I noticed, or I should say Lexi, one of the Seychelles guides, kind of put me onto one day was just after that Cyclone Fantala that came through and wiped Farquhar, actually. We were guiding Alphonse, and there's an influx of floating things, flip-flops, things like that. And low tide, we're outside the atoll kind of fishing around, and we're noticing, these explosions. And essentially, the GTs had figured out that crabs were sitting on top of water bottles, flip-flops, and everything. And the GTs were knocking the crabs off of this floating stuff, and it was abundant enough to fish to them. So it was really cool. And yeah, same with the crab migration that happens off the outer atolls. They suddenly now just disappear for a month or two to go feed on that, which is miles off, and then come back and happily feed on Cosmo after that.
Geez, they take advantage of whatever's happening at the fishery at the time.
Well, if you haven't seen that BBC footage on Blue Planet 2, check it out online. It is the most incredible thing. And if you weren't already captivated by the idea of chasing GTs, you're going to watch that footage and be like, oh, hell yes. I got to catch one of these things on a fly, because they're just unbelievable the way they hunt. And again, when they decide they want to eat something, it's violent. It's terrifying. And perhaps one of the coolest things when you target them on a fly, I think something that people aren't really prepared for is the ferocity and the violence of that eat. You make that cast, you start stripping. We're going to talk a little bit more about presentation in a second. But when they eat, I've seen anglers literally fall over backwards. They're so shocked and kind of taken aback by the ferocity of this eat. And, again, whether it's squishy baby sea turtles that are all, brand new and soft, or it's birds, or, crustaceans, crabs, whatever, when they decide they want something, they're going to have it. It's just that simple. Well, let me ask you this. So we also hear stories about GTs, and this is another thing from Farquhar, Alphonse, where there's the pets that kind of are around where the boats are coming in and out. Oftentimes they get fed, scraps of fish from the kitchen run that's coming in for the dining room. But there's these stories where the guides in the morning will say, okay, when we leave the little harbor here, when we come back in, these big GTs, some of them are, 100-pound plus fish, will follow us. These are the pets. Don't stick your hands in the water. Don't think you're faster than a fish. And there's always some guy who's like, I'm going to put my GoPro in there, right? and I'll be quick, I'll be quicker than the fish. No, there's pictures from Farquhar of, these bites that these guys have from GTs where they thought they were quicker than the fish. Yeah. You're not.
No. We have, stories of leisure guests, non-anglers that are staying on the island, and maybe they didn't get the briefing, or they decided to walk the beach and they're going to go rinse off their sandals in the water or something like that. And they come back to the fishing center with this horror story of some big black fish trying to eat their hand, It's wild. But at the same time, we're all curious as guides that you get off the water. It's like, okay, I see that 100-pounder swimming down the beach. I'm going to throw a fly at this thing. Yeah. It will not eat a fly. It is the smartest thing out there. Those pets, they've seen it all. They want the real thing. And yeah, we always challenge ourselves and rarely convert.
Yeah, they'll eat a GoPro, but they won't eat a brush fly that, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty interesting. Well, I want to get back to tides, because when we were discussing a few minutes ago about, you know, why they're on the flats, so many of these legendary GT fisheries are in destinations where the tides are significant. You might get 2-3 meter tides, you know, those big pushes when the flats are just flooded with the incoming big drops. Let's talk about how tides can affect GT behavior, you know, from the incoming tide to slack tide to the outgoing. Obviously, GT behavior, as you said a moment ago, Alec, is so largely based on feeding opportunities, right? And the tides, of course, will play a major role in where the bait fish are found, what's coming in, what's going off. GTs will essentially follow these bait fish on and off the flats with the tides. Talk to us a little bit about that. And, you know, people get pretty hung up on having specific tides or wanting to focus on a certain tidal window. How important is that when you're hunting GTs?
Yeah, it's really just in the kind of scenarios you're going to find yourself in. The, you know, two main tides we'll talk about is a spring tide, which is a lot of water movement, sometimes upwards of close to 3 meters variance from low to high, and then a neap, which is sometimes 0.1 meter of variation. And really what that's going to do is allow the fish either very little time to feed or a lot more time to casually feed. So, you know, often spring tides are desired by many anglers because timing, it's a lot easier to time these fish coming through that cut, like Gary was talking about, onto the flats to the high spot. You can kind of look at your watch and say, we need to be here now because the water's going to be at this depth. We're going to see them. But that being said, it doesn't always mean that GT is going to come up there. So it's a lot of moving around throughout the day. It can be action packed, or it can be a lot of scratching around. Whereas, you know, the neap tide with that little variance, there's always water on the flats. As long as it stays cold, you can really spend a lot of time searching around. And what's cool is these guys have really adopted pulling around the flats more, hunting them. And so you can go on this, you know, long mission across the flats looking and looking and nothing. And then all of a sudden you run into fish and they're all over stingrays everywhere. And so, yeah, it's just really, you know, you're able to hunt longer on the neeps and can still be quite as productive, but not as predictable, I guess I would say. So
that's what you see with spring tides.
Yeah.
But, you know, that brings up a good question, because I think a lot of anglers who have fished for GTs, they have it in their head. It's like, well, I got to have the spring tide. That's the, you know, that's going to be the best opportunity. But, you know, Gary, when you guys are guiding a full season out there, you don't have that luxury of being like, sorry, you're here the wrong week. You know, you need a spring tide. I mean, you guys know how to find these fish on neap tides, on transitionary tides, and everything in between. You always have to have a plan on where these fish are.
Yeah, I'd say it's just a different style of fishing. You know, spring tides, it's going to be in the surf, a lot of walking, a lot of wading on the reefs itself. And then, as Alex said, your neap tide, you're going to be poling around looking for fish mainly on the boat. And I've honestly enjoyed I've learned to love the springs. I mean, the neap tides more. You know, that window of time of that productive fishing is longer. Your spring tide fish are more concentrated. You've got 40 minutes of hot action, and then there's too much water after that. Whereas your neap tide, you've got a little bit of a longer window. A lot of guides would disagree with me. They would say spring tide, but it's just preference at the end of the day.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point. I mean, these are pretty massive tides, especially in like the Indian Ocean and places in the Pacific, where you might be wading a flat and it's, you know, calf deep to knee deep, but that spring tide starts pushing. And like you said, Gary, 40 minutes later, it's going to be up to your neck.
Yeah, you're going to be swimming quickly. Make sure you put your boat close.
Or you anchor close enough to the edge so you don't dry out for 3 hours.
Yeah, swimming channels to get back to the boats. Well, another question, Gary, is obviously movement of water. These fish love, you know, that fresh push. How important are temperatures when it comes to GT behavior and kind of overall happiness?
Yeah, so the GTs definitely enjoy cooler water, and that's all relative to cool in the Seychelles. I mean, it's warm water. It's the Indian Ocean, but they do also congregate around hot water. You know, the bait fish get stuck in that water, and the cheats will move in and out of that hot and cold separation hunting. So you are looking for hot water sections as well. You're looking for cold water. It just depends on what stage of the tide you're in.
and it's always moving, but you can feel it when you're out there wading. You know, it's kind of cool, fresh water. You feel it pushing across the flats, and then you get into those hot water pockets, and it's almost like you've stepped into a warm swimming pool, like a hot swimming pool. It's crazy.
I mean, you can even feel it sometimes when you're driving the boat still. Suddenly you come onto a flat and the water or the air gets really hot and humid. It's like, oh man, obviously the color and stuff like that. But yeah, Gary, tell us a little bit about the kind of the hot push on Alphonse.
The infamous hot push. So the hot push is this phenomenon that occurs where you have a depression of water that gets stuck on a flat during the low tide, and it sits and gets hot in the sun for about 2.5, 3 hours. And when that tide starts pushing, you know, all those bait fish that have been sitting in the shallows, that tide comes over the flat so aggressive and gets pushed into the lagoon, and the fish have learned that bait fish are just getting pushed into the cold fresh water, and you get these schools of massive jeets that sit there waiting for these fish to come over, and it's just free pickings for them. So, you know, if you time it right and you're in the right spot, we've seen shoals of 60, 70, 80 fish all over 100 centimeters. Just
waiting for that kind of barricade to push that
just
bait.
Blowing fish up. It is wild fishing. We've lost fly lines, rods, reels. It's carnage.
Well, I want to talk about equipment in just a second, but there's one thing you got to tell us about too, Gary. So we've talked a couple times about how GTs love to follow sharks. They love to follow rays. They're doing it because the bigger creatures are kind of dislodging prey as they're moving across the flats, and the GTs are coming in there and just picking it up, right? It makes things a little easier for the GTs when they're hunting. But there's a pretty famous deal on Alphonse, the Capel shoal.
Yes.
Tell us about this.
Gee, so basically the Capel shoal is a group of nurse sharks, you know, and it can be 20, 25 nurse sharks and a big group of GTs that cruise around together, and it's basically the ultimate death squad. You know,
but that move in slow motion, right?
They move slowly. They're not intimidated by anything. They are just, they just want to destroy everything. And the water boils when they come up on a school of bait fish or a finger. It's just shark tails everywhere and cheats, and it's tough to stay composed and get a fly in front of those things.
I've seen it and experienced it a couple times on my trips to Alphonse, and I've never seen professional, calm South African guides that are out there every day lose it as much as when they see the Capel shoal. It's like a little kid on Christmas morning. They go crazy when they see this.
You know that if you get a fish out of that shoal, he's going to be over a meter.
Yeah.
You know, it's a special opportunity.
Yeah, and you know, as a guide, you don't necessarily always see it. Like some of the guides have gone a couple seasons and still haven't bumped into it, and then they finally have that moment, and you get that radio call of, "Oh my God, it's coming your way!" And you're like, "Oh, you saw it, awesome!" Yeah. So it's really cool.
Well, let's talk for a moment about gear, all right? Because you're not just taking your normal saltwater stuff with you if you're going to specifically target GTs, because they're in a whole different category as far as their destructive capabilities, right? How brutal they can be on gear and equipment. But Gary, what is your kind of go-to setup for GTs as far as rod, reel, fly line combo? What do you like in when you're specifically targeting GTs?
So first things first, most important I would say is terminal tackle, being your reel, your fly line, leader, and what hook you're using. You know, a rod at that point is just a tool to get the fly in front of the fish. If the rod blows up, you've got a reel. But I'd say I swear by Shilton. You know, that cork drag system is so reliable. It locks down super hard. You're not going to have any problems. You don't want to lose a fish of a lifetime due to a reel failure.
You'll know how good your reel is when you hook a meter plus GT.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, heavier aggressive tapered lines, heavy shooting heads, obviously 12 weights, and then either 6.0s or 8.0 hooks religiously.
Yeah. Are you an 11 or 12 weight guy, Alec, for GTs?
You know, I've moved over to the 11 more and more, just with it being slightly more castable, I guess, so more enjoyable. And, you know, like we've been talking about, a lot of these situations, you're in shallower water, so you're keeping a pretty low angle with that rod. if I was fishing deeper water, I'd say 12 weight would have more play, just so I had more backbone with that deeper water fish. But yeah, I've been enjoying the 11 a lot, and I've seen more and more anglers kind of adopt it as well.
Yeah, and then Gary, you talked about terminal tackle. Now, one of the things when you get to any destination in the Seychelles, for instance, and a lot of other places too, on arrival day, all the guides come down and they basically take all the tackle that the anglers have shown up with and they take it all apart. They unspool the fly line, they check the backing, they check the connectivity of the backing to the fly line. Because the reality is you might have, fly shop guy in a little shop in Colorado who rigs this up and sends it over. But I mean, anything that can fail in this setup will, if it's not done right.
They are going to test your tackle, and you're right. We see that every week, where, someone might show up with the wrong backing or the wrong loops on their fly line. And we always change the loops on the fly lines. So we cut the factory loops off and we tie our own loops, reinforce them. Backing and reinforced loops is a big one.
Yeah, you're fishing like 65 to 100 pound backing.
Yeah.
You need that. Yeah. GT specific fly lines, right? You've got different core materials that are stronger, that are designed to tackle these big creatures. Yeah, super important.
Yeah, for sure.
Let's talk a little bit about flies and specifically hooks, because we've gone on and on about, if GTs want to eat, they might eat. And you've given us examples of like, well, they learn, so you can't just fool them with the same pattern all the time. But it really comes down to when you're trying to land a big GT, the quality of the hook. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I like a hook with the larger gape. The AREX hook is really good. The
AREX,
the AREX.
Yeah, the great hooks.
Yeah, phenomenal hook. The Gamma Atoll is also a great hook, but you're gonna put a hook through its paces. I mean, you're fishing 150 pound leader often on a 80 pound core fly line with a locked reel, often palming that reel, putting even more drag on. So yeah, if you're going to put a hook through its paces, for sure.
Yeah. If you can straighten any saltwater hook, this is the environment it's going to happen.
You're going to straighten it on these fish.
Yeah. Exactly. What are your thoughts on hooks, Alec?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And, the more I've fished around the world, the more questions I get about the Seychelles fly and hook choice being so big and burly and things like that. And, the 6-aught and 8-aught really finds its place in any other anglers in the saltwater, fly boxes. And they're like, why do you guys fish a hook so big? And really what I think it's come down to is just how quick that fish eats and turns or doesn't turn or whatever. You're just trying to get some purchase. That big gap is going to get somewhere in his very hard mouth, and you're going to be able to hook him. Now, yeah, to Gary's point is you're going to test that thing to its max. So you're putting well beyond the right amount of pressure you should put on a fish on this GT to try to stop him, because he's going to try to go home and break you off and all the nasty stuff. So it's got to be a high quality steel that's forged, and it's going to have to hold up to the most brutal of conditions. And then, it also plays a role in sinking that fly at a certain pace. You're going to be fishing a bigger profile in general, and that material needs some weight to get down. So without, barbell eyes or lead or something like that, that hook actually does a great job of kind of cutting through the water surface and letting your fly track right.
Yeah. And, these are not fish that play fair either. I mean, you've got to really bully a GT when you get him on. You've got to try to break that fish as quickly as you can. And meanwhile, he's headed for bommies and coral heads, and they're going to play dirty, right? If they can exploit a weakness, whether it's with your tackle or with your skills, if they can use their environmental factors to break you off or wrap you, they're going to do it.
Yeah, we were actually talking about this morning over coffee. It was like, this is not a IGFA leader fish for the most part. Sure, I guess you could do that, but if you want to land that big fish, you've got to put the brakes on them, and you're going to put a lot of pressure well beyond 30, 40, 50 pounds to hopefully stop him before he takes you into the junk.
Yeah, 100%. I'm not the first to say it, but someone put it best. It's combat fishing. It's a fight.
Yeah, they're not going to play fair, and so you shouldn't play fair either.
No, exactly.
You got to bully these fish and try to land them as quickly as possible. Talk to us about some of your favorite fly patterns for GTs.
Jeez, a big one that we've been fishing in the last 2 seasons or so is the beast fly. That is one of the most popular flies, especially for bigger fish. a beast fly is super effective. It's easy for clients to cast. It's light, and it's a fly that can be 20, 30 centimeters in length. That's fairly easy to throw. So that's a big one. Poppers are always fun, and then just normal bucktail, brush flies tied on a 6-0 hook. That's the go-to.
You've designed a lot of flies, ALEC, for the Seychelles that you've actually created and that are still used and wildly popular years later. What are some of the things that you think about when designing GT flies?
Yeah, Gary kind of said it first with easy to cast. That's probably the most important thing, is you at least get your fly out there. So be mindful about how you dress your fly. It's easy to overdress something because you're trying to feed hopefully the biggest fish you've ever caught in your life, and they eat birds. So, but yeah, being mindful. So that's going to be easy to cast. It's going to have lots of movement. And kind of ring true to its surroundings. So you're going to, have darker flies for the darker situations, lighter flies for when you're fishing the sand and things like that. Overall, not too much flash, pretty sparse. But anywhere from that kind of 5-inch all the way up to, like the 12-inch beast fly. Yeah. But it's been really cool to watch this evolution from when I was guiding. We were fishing more flashy profiles, more traditional brush flies. And now these guys have adopted what's, really like a 40 or 50-year-old style fly from Bob Popovic. That's bucktail. So it's cool to see this old school fly making a comeback and being the favorite.
Well, Gary, I want to ask you a little bit about maybe like a golden scenario as a guide, right? Most of the time when you guys are chasing GTs, you're wade fishing. That's what makes some of these destinations so spectacular, is you're not on the bow of the boat in deep water. You're actually on foot. You might be wading the surf. You might be wading a hard-packed white sand flat, kind of everything in between. But talk to us about like the picture-perfect GT presentation. And again, it's going to vary with all kinds of things, wind, conditions, visibility. But you're out with your clients. You're wading across a flat. Let's say you're, thigh-deep water. You spot a GT coming in.
Yes. Wow.
Talk us through that.
Picture-perfect. Best scenario to have personally is a fish on a ray. You're walking down that flat and you see that ray coming in. You can clearly see there's a black shape on its back, and the ray's not moving too quickly. You can get set up. If you need to change your angle, you can change your angle. And as that fish approaches you, you need to get that fly 15 to 20 feet in front of him. Wait for him to move onto it, and when it's about 10 feet away, start stripping it, and he's going to light up, and before you know it, he's going to have that fly in his mouth.
Now, is this a slow strip?
Well, any video you look on YouTube about GT fishing, it's always strap, but just one long strip to give that fly some movement. And, once that fish lights up, you got to move it quickly. If you miss a strip, he's not going to eat your fly.
Yeah. You can't outstrip a GT.
No, you cannot move it. You cannot move it quick enough.
And the key thing is, and you mentioned this earlier, ALEC, you don't want to put the fly right on their head, because even though they're typically fearless fish, that will blow a fish up. They'll be gone. So you lead them with a good distance. You make that first strip to get their attention, and then you read the fish.
Yeah, you read the fish. If he comes fast, you move it fast. You move it like hell. If he comes slow, you just keep your tempo. Keep it going slow. A lot of those big fish especially, you start off long and slow, and he's going to keep coming slowly. He's going to keep coming slowly. And, for a fish of 100 pounds to expend so much energy to eat something small, he might not be charged up. He might come slowly, and a lot of those big fish take on a slow strip.
Yeah. What common mistakes during the presentation process do you oftentimes see from anglers? What do they do wrong when trying to, you got the fish in front of you, you've set them up, everything's perfect, they make that cast. What are common mistakes at that point?
Well, I'd say the biggest thing is people are not ready to strip straight away on that as that fly lands. And, that possibly comes from traditionally fishing for trout, where you're in a still water and you're throwing your line. You don't really need to strip it straight away. So you let the line leave your left hand. But a lot of the time that fly hits the water. Those fish hear it, first of all, turn around to see to have a look, and they'll come for it straight away. And if you can't move that fly straight away, he's going to charge the fly. He's going to do 2 circles around it and then swim away, laughing at you. Yeah.
They're good at that. Oftentimes, and I think that brings up a really good point, it behooves you to be able to, the second that fly is shooting out and it's making that final presentation, you're already essentially coming tight to strip that. So when it hits the water, you're fully engaged and tight on that.
Yeah, and this kind of plays out to the lead again too. Is like that 2 to 3 rod lengths actually is for you too, to be able to get your hand. And then speaking to missing a strip, you will be amazed how hot that fish will be coming, and the minute it stops, that fish just turns gray and swims away, and it's like, oh my God, what happened? So, the common thing is, I still have to tell myself this too, is stop looking at the fish now. You've laid it out there. He's coming. Just look at your hands. Make sure you're connecting with each strip, and it's going to make itself go tight. Because otherwise sometimes it eats it too, and you just freeze. It's so exciting. You just saw this thing eat your fly, and then you forget to set the hook. So,
well, we talked about the violence of the eat. I mean, I think a lot of times when people are new to GT fishing, they're just not prepared for this.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to describe the ferocity, which when they decide they're going to put something in their mouth, it can be terrifying. The way they eat and the violence and the speed. A lot of times, as we said, anglers will start walking backwards and trip and fall over because they're just not used to this kind of behavior out of sport fish.
Yeah, I mean, just the speed. The speed is like nothing you've ever seen before. You can't strip fast enough, and you try to tell people all the time, like bigger, longer, faster strips. And, they're doing these kind of little trouty strips or tarpon strips. And it's like, no, you don't understand. Like, you should probably be running back too at the same time. And these fish will eat the end of your rod tip if they want to.
They'll come right up to your feet.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, a lot of what we talk about on this podcast with regard to destinations and different species, it all revolves around preparation for the trip. How can anglers arrive ready and in the conversation from morning one, that first moment of day one on their trip? Let me ask you, Gary, what can people do to best prepare for GT fishing ahead of time? What can they do to arrive ready?
First things first, bring the right tackle, bring the right equipment, bring an extra fly line. Bring an extra fly line, make sure you've got a good reel. You're not going to need a huge amount of flies. You might go through 10 to 20 flies throughout the week. It's not, trout fishing where you're trying to match a hatch and change a fly every 5 minutes. They're usually not very fussy creatures. A couple good flies, good, GT fly lines. And then, 80 to 150 pound leader.
Yeah, you're going to need it.
You are going to need it.
Well, and we also talk a lot, and it doesn't matter what destination we're discussing or profiling, the importance of practicing your cast. It seems so basic or rudimentary, yet we ask guides from all over the world, one thing people can do ahead of time, people are like, just practice your casting.
Honestly, if you're going to spend $1,000 on a fly rod and $1,500 on a reel, please just spend, $150, $200, go for some casting lessons. It is going to make or break a trip. You will have scenarios where a fish is very catchable, but you can't catch it because you're not able to make that 60-foot, 70-foot shot.
Yeah. And when you're working on your casting, you're working on distance, obviously, but other factors are speed.
Yes.
Meaning not how fast you're casting, but how fast can you get that fly out there? Exactly. Is it 2 false casts or is it 6 false casts?
No, the less the better.
Yeah.
The less the better.
Yeah, accuracy is important. And one factor you guys always deal with, and really in all of these saltwater environments, is wind, right? If you're practicing inside a gymnasium and that's like the extent of it, then you get out on the flats and it's, it's blowing 10 or 15. You still got to be able to make that cast into the wind, across the wind. We always say when you're practicing your casting, go out on those stormy days. When it's blowing hard, that's the best preparation you can have for any saltwater trip.
Yeah, and if you can't, work on your back cast. It's not mandatory, but man, that is sure a nice tool. Can't tell you how many scenarios where all it takes is 30-foot back cast. Otherwise, the guy's standing on the front and he's looking back at the guy like, "Can you move the boat?" And it's like, we don't have time for that. No. So. Yeah, the cast, if you can practice it, and it's, yes, a big rod, heavy fly, all this stuff, but those lines are designed to cast well. It's timing. So just getting used to it, get out there, play with it. It's not that hard. I've seen little old ladies cast very far lines because they have their timing down.
That's all it is.
Just be ready. Arrive ready.
And then, you've spent all this money to go on this trip. These guides are still happy to teach you, but it might be the first 5 minutes of the first day where you have a 90 centimeter jeet swimming up to the boat, and he doesn't have time to now tell you about the double haul or whatever like that. So be ready for the first minutes of the day.
Yeah. Well, are there any books or videos you guys recommend? I mean, if people are going to go on a GT trip, if they're prepping a little bit, they're trying to get more information, anything out there that you guys would recommend as far as reading, books, videos, anything like that?
Man, I mean, definitely online, there's all sorts of great resources. I've seen more and more kind of grouped pages pop up on like Facebook and stuff like that are really resourceful because you're getting people from all ends of the earth, old guides and stuff like that, kind of inputting on the things like that. But yeah, then books like Peter McLeod's book, awesome resource. He's got some solid knowledge in there from a lot of the, guys that pretty much started the whole movement. So certainly that. And just do your homework, find the end of the internet, trying to find the next piece of information. It's always good.
Right on. Well, Alec, if people have listened to this last hour, if they're like, okay, I'm sold, I'm ready to go GT fishing, what are the next steps? What should people do?
Yeah, give me a call, and it's not going to be a quick conversation. You got to be honest with yourself of, what you're trying to accomplish with GT fishing. And also, it's a popular fish, so we might be looking a little bit further down the road, but happy to explore it with you. And there's lots of great options out there.
A lot of great options. Well, gentlemen, this has been some incredible information, some great facts. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thanks for sharing your knowledge and experiences with our listeners. I think this has been great.
Super fun, Jim. Thanks.
Oh, cheers, Jim. Thanks. It's been great.
Absolutely. Gary, enjoy your time here in Montana. It's a little different, when you're fishing for trout. You don't want to, set quite as hard. You're going to fish in a little lighter tippet.
It's going to take some getting used to it. 3-weight rod doesn't feel quite the same, but I'll get used to it.
Yeah, that's right.
We can't wait to give him a bad trout set habit for him to go back to the Seychelles and have all his buddies. One last thing, there is a cool bet that's happening on Cosmo, and I want you to tell us a little bit about this. Something to do with a tattoo.
Okay, so the running bet for the season was the last guide to guide a meter fish. The punishment being getting a tattoo of a 60 centimeter GT. And there was throughout the season, good competition going. It came down to two chaps named Trevor and Jono, and Trevor eventually got it and radioed Jono and said, "Sorry, my boy, you getting the tattoo." There's some drinks had that night, and
And has this come to fruition yet?
He hasn't. I believe he hasn't got it just yet. But I'm on my way home in the next 2 weeks, so I'll pay him a visit and make sure that.
That's a lot of ink.
Yeah.
60 centimeter GT. Wow, that's impressive. Well, if you're headed to Cosmo next year, you can verify whether or not this has happened as a guest. So good stuff. It's amazing what you guys come up with when you're stuck out on these islands for months at a time.
You've got to keep yourself entertained.
Clearly. Well, that is great. Thank you guys again for joining us. That is it for this latest episode of Waypoints, the podcast that is 100% dedicated to travel, destination angling, and the search for adventure. Be sure to visit yellowdogflyfishing.com to plan and research travel, source gear, equipment, and flies for your next destination, and stay up to date on the latest angling news and developments. Join us for our next episode, and always remember that life is short and no one ever regretted a life of adventure.
This has been another episode of Waypoints, the podcast of fly fishing travel and adventure angling. Waypoints is produced by Brian Gregson, with music provided by the Steep Canyon Rangers. Visit yellowdogflyfishing.com for more destination profiles, travel news, and expert advice, and be sure to join us for our next episode.